In 2003, my husband and I, who's also a medical doctor, we worked together, we were on our way into Iraq about 2 days after the fall of Saddam's statue in Al Fardous Square. And we found ourselves at the home of a very dear friend of ours. Her name was Akila al-Hashimi. And as we sat in her living room drinking tea, her two little nieces scattered about the house. They were 6 and 8. And they were practicing their French. Because Akila, who is a civil servant with the Department of Foreign Affairs in Baghdad, she had a degree in French literature from the Sorbonne. And she had promised her nieces that now that the war was over, that the sanctions would end, and she was going to take the little girls to Paris. And as we sat in her home, Akila turned to us and she said, "I feel as if the last 30 years have been confiscated from me. First by Saddam, then by the Iran-Iraq war, then by the sanctions and the US-led war in 1991, and now the most recent war." And she said, "I hope it's over because I am ready to live my life." A few months later, Akila would be one of only 3 women appointed to the interim Iraqi Governing Council. And a few months after that, my husband and I were lying in bed in the middle of the night, and we received a phone call. And it was a journalist friend of ours. "Turn on the news," she said. "Akila has been shot." And we turned to the BBC, and they were running footage from Akila's driveway, and it was covered in blood, and there were 2 little girls standing at the side crying. And a few months after that, we watched a dear friend of ours, Margaret Hassan of the aid agency Care International, beg for her life in a videotape message that aired on all the major news networks. Akila and Margaret were both women, they were both civilians, and they were both trying extremely hard to make Iraq a country that would be better for the citizens, because that is what they wanted and that is what they deserved. But why did they die? Well, the answer is as complex as it is obvious. They died because they were there. They died because of a brutal insurgency that is financed from a myriad of sources, but that swells its ranks among the disaffected and the uneducated and the impoverished populations of the world. They died because of the ease of availability of weapons in Iraq, including AK-47s, that make it possible for any pathological entrepreneur to grab a gun and make money off of coercion and kidnapping. But they also died because of something that's been happening very recently in our line of work, but particularly over the last 10 years. They died because of a gradual blurring of the margins, blurring of the lines between the military and between humanitarian operations. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the military has engaged consistently in a public relations exercise to win the hearts and win the minds of local people, and they have done that by engaging in things that are traditionally the domain of humanitarian actors. Food distributions, provision of hospitals, provision of health services, and the like. It started in Somalia. It was made worse during the bombings in Kosovo, where NATO set up refugee camps behind most of the armed force areas. It continues in Afghanistan, and it continues in Iraq. I'm not talking about peacekeeping. I'm not talking about what Erwin referred to earlier in terms of a United Nations sanctioned protection force. Those are not the same things. But a dramatic shift in the paradigm around war requires a concerted effort to maintain and protect a neutral humanitarian space. Because girls that are being raped cannot go to the military to report that human rights abuse. Children who need to go to school will not go to a school that was rebuilt by the armed forces. And that's a reality. So in summary now, I've talked a lot about how I want to change this paradigm around war. And so you might be thinking, well, what can I do? What are the steps that are necessary? Well, there are a few of them, and I'm going to give you a couple in my remaining 50 seconds. Number one is we need to invest as a country, but also as a global community, in preventing war and not in waging war. Annual worldwide military spending is approximately $1 trillion. That was for 2005. By comparison, overseas development assistance was 1/20th this amount. We need to spend more on rebuilding health, education, and social infrastructure, and in the promotion of good governance. For that matter, number two is we need to encourage Canadians, and all of Canada really, to step up. Right now, our overseas development assistance is at 0.27%. The target of 0.7% was set by our very own Lester B. Pearson. We are 14th in the world in terms of our contributions to ODA, and that is unacceptable. We need to end the culture of impunity, which is also something that Irwin referred to, and also William Sampson. What does that mean? Well, in my mind, that means continuing our support for institutions such as the International Criminal Court. Number 4, we need to aggressively address the AIDS pandemic worldwide, because when we talk about security, with 40 million people living with AIDS and 15 million AIDS orphans, we cannot talk about security without thinking about the impact that this will have not only on current generations, but on future generations. Number 5, we need non-governmental organizations to do a better job of communicating the impact of war globally, and to do that in a way that is constructive. The images that you see on television that alienate you from the child who's living through war, in the end, those are more destructive than constructive, and that practice needs to end. Number 6 is we need to take this issue to the boardrooms, and this is something that you're better equipped to do than I am. Corporate social responsibility begins and ends with all of you. It needs to be a part of your practice in everything that you do from a business perspective. I think I'm at number 7. Number 7 is the media. And again, I'm not as equipped to handle this as many of you, but I think when Peter Mansbridge gets bumped by an idol wannabe show on the CBC of all institutions, I don't know, I spent all day yesterday looking to see if the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were behind me. That's got to change. Sometimes you have to give the people what they need and not necessarily what they want. Number 9 is we need to continue supporting, or number 8, we need to continue supporting the work of the United Nations. It may be flawed, it may be imperfect, but it's the best that we got. And number 9 is we need to continue to invest, not just in one child at a time, but in one community at a time. It may feel good to have a picture of your child on your fridge. It'll feel better when you have a picture of a school. And finally, we need to stop ceding to this notion that life and loss are inherently more relevant over here than over there. Because our actions, whether it's the cell phones that we use, the cars that we drive, the gas that we put in those cars, the diamonds that we buy, all of those actions unwittingly send this message. And all of our inactions, from Rwanda to northern Uganda to the Congo to Darfur, they reinforce that message. People all around the world deserve dignity and they deserve respect. And it is time for us to give children, whether they live here or whether they live in Africa or Iraq or Afghanistan, those children deserve the same level of attention, concern, and protection as their own children here at home. Thank you.
Samantha.
Sorry, I was dashing off.
Thank you.